In 1886, a French aristocrat named Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvidre finished a manuscript that would have changed his reputation forever, and not in the way he wanted. The book was called Mission de l'Inde, and in it, Saint-Yves made a claim so extraordinary that even his closest allies begged him to suppress it. He described in painstaking detail a vast subterranean kingdom called Agartha, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, governed by a supreme pontiff called the Brahmatma. It was home to millions of inhabitants and possessed technology and spiritual knowledge that made surface civilization look backwards. And here's what makes the whole thing genuinely strange. Saint-Yves wasn't a fringe thinker by any means. He was a well-connected and widely respected political theorist with friends in high places, a man who'd spent years developing a model of ideal governance he called synarchy. He destroyed all but 2 copies of the book before his death, but a few survived, and the idea he tried to bury refused to stay underground. To understand how Agartha lodged itself so deeply in the Western imagination, we've got to go back further than the original idea itself. The notion that the Earth might be hollow, or that civilizations might exist beneath the crust, is genuinely ancient. Mythologies across the world describe underworlds, from the Greek Hades to the Hindu Patala, from the Norse Svartalfheim to the Aztec Mictlan. These weren't always places of punishment, and in many traditions, the underworld was simply another realm, populated by beings with their own rules and their own hierarchies. But the idea shifted from mythology to something resembling early science in 1692. The English astronomer Edmund Halley, the same man who predicted the return of Halley's Comet, proposed a hollow Earth model to the Royal Society of London. Halley was trying to explain anomalies in compass readings, and his model suggested the Earth consisted of concentric shells, each potentially capable of supporting life. It was wrong, obviously, but it was a genuinely serious hypothesis from a serious scientist working with the tools available to him at the time. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the hollow Earth had become a fixture of speculative thought. The American Army officer John Cleves Sims spent the 1820s petitioning the United States Congress to fund an expedition to the North Pole. He believed a massive opening led into the Earth's interior, and though he didn't get his funding, he got a surprising amount of public attention. The idea that something might exist beneath our feet, something vast and hidden and possibly intelligent, had a grip on people that pure debunking simply couldn't shake. Saint-Yves d'Alvidre didn't invent the hollow Earth, but he gave it a name, a government, and a purpose. His version of Agartha was a functioning civilization, spiritually advanced, technologically superior, and organized according to the principles of synarchy. This was his own political philosophy, almost Confucian in nature, which emphasized rule by a harmonious elite. He claimed to have learned about Agartha from a mysterious figure he identified only as a Hindu informant named Haji Sharif. This name would, of course, be highly unusual for someone who's Hindu, given that it's a very clearly Islamic name, but believers accepted this was an anonymization of the original source. This man reportedly taught him Sanskrit and introduced him to esoteric Eastern traditions. What made Saint-Yves' account so compelling was its specificity, since he didn't just wave his hands and say there was a kingdom underground. He described its libraries, its universities, its government structure, and wrote about how Agartha's inhabitants had mastered technologies that surface humanity hadn't yet conceived of. He placed the kingdom somewhere beneath Central Asia, connected to the surface through hidden tunnels in the Himalayas and other mountain ranges. He argued that Agartha's leaders had been quietly influencing the course of human history from below. The fact that he tried to destroy the book only added to its mystique. Mission de l'Inde was finally published posthumously in 1910, and by then, the legend had taken on a life of its own. Supporters of Agartha believed that the text had been suppressed by the authorities, while detractors agreed on the suppression, but believed his colleagues did it for his own sake. The next major chapter in the Agartha story came from a very different kind of figure. In 1922, the Polish scientist and explorer Ferdynand Ossendowski published Beasts, Men, and Gods, an account of his harrowing journey through Mongolia. Ossendowski claimed that during his travels, Mongolian lamas and princes had told him about a subterranean kingdom ruled by a figure called the King of the World. This ruler, they said, could command the forces of nature, communicated telepathically with the surface, and would one day emerge to usher in a new age. Ossendowski's book was a sensation, and it sold widely across Europe and America, and brought the idea of an underground kingdom to a mass audience for the first time. But it also brought scrutiny, especially because this wasn't specifically called Agartha. The French esotericist René Guénon, who published his own book on the subject Le Roi du Monde in 1927, argued that Ossendowski had likely drawn on Saint-Yves' earlier work. Guénon took the concept in a more explicitly metaphysical direction, treating Agartha less as a literal underground city and more as a spiritual center of the world. The tension between these two interpretations, literal and symbolic, has defined the Agartha conversation ever since. Some believers treat it as a real physical place, while others treat it as an allegory for hidden spiritual knowledge. A not insignificant number of people have tried to split the difference, arguing that the truth is somehow both, that it both exists and does not exist. It's essentially impossible to talk about Agartha without addressing the uncomfortable territory of its adoption by occult-tinged elements within the Third Reich. During the 1920s and 1930s, various fringe groups in Germany became fascinated with the idea of a hollow earth and the advanced beings supposedly dwelling within it. The Vril Society, named after a fictional energy source from an 1871 novel, reportedly believed in a subterranean group that had harnessed the all-powerful energy, also called Vril. Now, the extent to which the Vril Society actually existed as a formal organization versus being a later invention of post-war mythmakers is a matter of genuine scholarly debate. Much of what's been written about it traces back to a rather fantastical 1960 book called The Morning of the Magicians, which contains a mix of fact and legend. What is well documented is that Heinrich Himmler and elements within the SS had a serious interest in occult archaeology. This included funding expeditions to Tibet and other locations in search of evidence supporting their mythologies. Whether Agartha specifically featured in their beliefs, or whether that connection was amplified after, remains hotly contested. One of the more interesting threads in the Agartha story is its relationship to the Buddhist concept of Shambhala. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Shambhala is a hidden kingdom, sometimes described as existing in a valley beyond the Himalayas. It's sometimes described as a physical place, but other times as an entirely spiritual realm, accessible only through meditation and enlightenment. The Kalachakra Tantra, a major Tibetan Buddhist text, describes Shambhala as a place where the Dharma has been preserved in its purest form, ruled by a line of enlightened kings. The overlap with the Agartha legend is hard to miss, especially given the two sources from which the Agartha legend sprung up in the West. It's a hidden kingdom in Central Asia, governed by a wise ruler, preserving ancient knowledge, destined to play a decisive role in the future of humanity. It's very likely that Saint-Yves, Ossendowski, and other Western writers drew on garbled or second-hand accounts of the Shambhala tradition when constructing their narratives. But there's an important distinction, and in traditional Buddhist teaching, Shambhala isn't necessarily a place you can walk to. It's mostly interpreted as a spiritual reality, accessible through practice and realization. The Western Agartha tradition, by contrast, has tended to literalize the concept, turning it into something you could theoretically find, with enough maps and enough digging. Agartha persists, and one common question is why the idea has such staying power. Part of the answer is probably psychological. Humans have always been drawn to the idea that there's more to the world than what we can see. The notion that something vast and meaningful might be hidden just out of reach speaks to a deep and persistent longing. It's the same impulse that drives interest in lost continents, ancient astronauts, and hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx. The most famous Viking who ever lived, the man whose name is practically synonymous with the entire Viking Age, may never have existed at all. Or perhaps he existed, but wasn't one man. Or he was one man, but almost nothing we think we know about him is true. The historical record doesn't give us a clean answer, and the deeper you dig, the murkier it gets. This is the story of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, and the debate that's been surrounding him for over a millennium. Most people's understanding of Ragnar Lothbrok comes filtered through the History Channel series, and there's nothing wrong with that as a starting point. But strip away the dramatization, and what you're left with is a figure from Old Norse saga literature who reportedly conquered vast territories. He raided Paris, fathered a dynasty of legendary warrior sons, and met his end in a snake pit in the court of King Aella of Northumbria. It's an incredible story, but it also doesn't hold up particularly well under historical scrutiny. The name itself is the first thing worth pausing on, since Lothbrok roughly translates to shaggy pants. According to tradition, the name came from a pair of specially treated hide trousers his wife Aslaug made for him as protection against serpents. Already we're likely firmly in the territory of folklore rather than biography, given how he supposedly perished. No serious historian treats the origin story of his name as anything other than a narrative device layered onto the character long after the events it supposedly describes. The trouble with Ragnar is that the major sources describing his life were all composed centuries after the period in which he supposedly lived. The Gesta Danorum, written in Latin around 1200 by the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, provides one of the earliest extended accounts. Saxo was working from a combination of older Norse histories, Icelandic oral traditions, and earlier chronicles, notably drawing on the work of Adam of Bremen from around 1075. His version of Ragnar is a Danish king of extraordinary ambition who appoints his sons to govern territories stretching from Scotland to the river systems of Central Asia. It's a claim so expansive it immediately invites skepticism, though given the range of Vikings, it's not entirely impossible. He wasn't claiming that they were sent to China, for instance. Then there's the Ragnar saga, an Icelandic legendary saga composed in the 13th century. This text gives us the most detailed narrative of Ragnar's life, his marriages, his exploits, and his dramatic death. Complementing it is the tale of Ragnar's sons, which shifts focus to the next generation and their campaigns of vengeance across England. A poem called the Krakemal, meanwhile, purports to be Ragnar's own death song, recited as he perished in the snake pit, recounting his battles across a vast geographical range. These are rich and compelling sources, but of course they are also inherently flawed. They're literary compositions written 300 to 400 years after the events they describe, shaped by the political and cultural needs of their own time. The sagas weren't history in the sense we'd understand them today, but something more akin to historical fiction. They were entertainment, cultural preservation, and political legitimation all woven together. They were working within a tradition where embellishment and conflation of historical figures was standard practice seen as entirely acceptable. But here's the thing, that doesn't mean there isn't a seed of historical truth in the legend, because there definitely is. If there's a single thread connecting the legend to something concrete, it's the siege of Paris in 845. Frankish annals record that in March of that year, a fleet of roughly 120 Viking ships, carrying more than 5,000 warriors, sailed up the Seine. According to these annals, they were under the command of a powerful Viking chieftain called Regan Harris. This force sacked Paris and extracted a massive ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver from the Frankish king Charles the Bald before withdrawing. Regan Harris is only known from this single raid. He appears, does something extraordinary, and then vanishes from the Frankish records entirely. Interestingly, the name Ragnar can be rendered as Regner, and could plausibly be a shortened form of Regan Harris. Alternatively, Regan Harris might be an attempt to Latinize an unfamiliar Old Norse name. Several historians have suggested that this raider was the historical kernel around which the Ragnar legend eventually crystallized. The connection is tantalizing but far from proven, since even if it's true, the name Ragnar itself was exceedingly common. We're essentially matching a common Norse name across sources written in different languages, in different countries, centuries apart. The most iconic element of the Ragnar story, his execution by King Aelle of Northumbria via a pit full of venomous serpents, is also one of the most historically dubious. There's no archaeological evidence that snake pits were constructed or used for execution anywhere in the British Isles during this period. More importantly, the motif isn't original to Ragnar, and all evidence suggests that it became something of a trope. The Poetic Edda contains at least 2 separate poems describing the Burgundian king Gunnar being thrown into a snake pit by Attila the Hun. This is a story that predates the Ragnar tradition and almost certainly influenced it. Some believe later writers were borrowing a dramatic death from an existing literary stockpile and attaching it to their hero. The Krakemal, that supposed death poem, doesn't help establish historicity either. Scholars have dated its composition to the 12th century at the earliest, placing it firmly in the era of saga composition rather than the Viking Age itself. It reads less like a preserved oral tradition and more like a literary exercise designed to give Ragnar a suitably heroic send-off. Here's where the story takes its most interesting turn. While Ragnar himself remains stubbornly elusive in the historical record, his supposed sons are remarkably well documented. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a near-contemporary English source, records that in 865, a massive Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army invaded East Anglia. They were under the leadership of Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba. These are real, historically attested individuals whose campaigns reshaped the political map of England. The sagas claim the invasion was motivated by revenge for Ragnar's death at Aelle's hands. The Chronicle also confirms that Aelle of Northumbria perished during the Viking conquest of York in 867. But the Chronicle itself never mentions Ragnar, never references a snake pit, and never frames the invasion as an act of vengeance. The revenge narrative appears only in later Norse sources. These sources had every reason to retroactively provide a dramatic motivation for what may have simply been an opportunistic military campaign. This is the central paradox. His sons were undeniably real, their campaigns documented in multiple independent sources. But the father who supposedly united them, that man exists only in texts written long after the fact, in texts that freely mix historical events with legendary material. The scholarly consensus that's emerged is that Ragnar Lothbrok is most likely a composite figure. He was likely a literary creation assembled from the deeds of several real Viking leaders whose exploits were gradually merged into a single legendary biography. Reginhirus may have contributed one layer, but other Viking chieftains active in Ireland, Francia, and England during the mid-9th century likely contributed others. The saga authors, working centuries later, wove these threads into a coherent narrative because that's what sagas do. They create order and meaning out of the chaos of history. This doesn't make Ragnar unimportant, and if anything, it makes him more interesting. A single Viking raider is a footnote, but a legendary figure who absorbed the achievements of an entire generation of Norse warriors is something different entirely. He became the symbolic father of a dynasty that reshaped medieval Europe, and that's a phenomenon worth understanding. Ragnar Lothbrok tells us less about what actually happened in the 9th century and more about how the Norse world wanted to remember itself. Perhaps that's the most honest thing we can say about the most famous Viking, is that the legend became more real than any single person behind it could have ever have been. A millennia later, that legend is still doing exactly what the saga authors designed it to do, and is still entertaining people today. After all, had these authors not made Ragnar a larger-than-life figure, the life of any of the individual Vikings who composed him likely wouldn't have been made into a show. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here asking you to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you're enjoying this video. Also, don't forget to hit that share button and send my content to anyone you know who appreciates historical content and history mysteries. In the year 476, a teenage emperor with the absurdly grand name Romulus Augustus, a name that literally combined Rome's mythical founder with its first emperor, was quietly removed. A barbarian general named Odoacer did it, and he didn't even bother claiming the throne for himself, choosing to present himself as a vassal of Eastern Rome. He packed the teenager off to a comfortable villa in Campania with a generous pension and sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople. And just like that, according to centuries of textbooks, the ancient world ended and the Middle Ages began. There's just one problem with this version of events. Almost nobody alive at the time seems to have noticed or cared. If you went through a Western education system at any point in the last 150 years, you were almost certainly taught that the medieval period began in 476. It's clean, it's dramatic, and it fits the narrative we like to tell ourselves about history. That civilizations rise, they peak, they collapse, and then something new emerges. The deposition of Romulus Augustus by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who'd been serving as a mercenary commander in the Roman army, became the convenient symbolic bookend. But here's the thing. The people living through it didn't experience a clean break. The Roman Senate continued to meet, and Roman law still governed daily life across much of Italy. Churches kept their doors open, aqueducts kept running, and Latin remained the language of administration and learning. The entire eastern half of the empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, carried on for nearly another 1,000 years, with its capital in Constantinople. The idea that civilization simply switched off at a single date and time is a story we imposed on the past much later, not one that the people of the 5th century would have recognized. The version of history that most of us inherited owes an enormous debt to Edward Gibbon, who published his magnum opus between 1776 and 1789. His 6-volume work on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire became one of the most influential books ever written. It cemented the idea that Rome's collapse was a catastrophic civilizational failure caused by moral decay, the spread of Christianity, and the onslaught of barbarian invasions. In this framework, the medieval period wasn't just what came after Rome, it was a direct consequence of Rome's failure. The Dark Ages label, though it actually predates this work by several centuries, drew much of its popular staying power from this narrative. The problem is that the picture this framework paints is dramatically oversimplified. It treats the end of the Western Roman Empire as a single event rather than a process that unfolded over generations, and it frames everything that followed as decline. More recent scholarship has pushed back hard against this, arguing that the transition from antiquity to the medieval world was far more gradual. One of the most provocative challenges to the 476 date came from a Belgian historian writing in the early 20th century. His central argument, published posthumously in 1937, was startling in its simplicity. The real break between the ancient and medieval worlds wasn't the fall of Rome at all. It was the rise of Islam. And his reasoning went like this. Even after the Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman political authority in the West, the Mediterranean world remained culturally and economically unified. Trade networks persisted, and the flow of goods continued to circulate across the old Roman Mediterranean. What shattered that unity wasn't Odoacer or the Visigoths or the Vandals. It was the Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, which severed the Mediterranean trade routes and cut Western Europe off from the wealth of the East. In this reading, the medieval world, with its feudal economies, its agrarian focus, and its political fragmentation, didn't begin until the 7th or 8th century. This thesis was enormously influential, and it remains hotly debated today. Starting in the 1970s, another school of thought emerged that questioned the entire premise of the debate. Rather than arguing about exactly when antiquity ended and when the medieval period began, they got around it by creating a liminal space between antiquity and the medieval world. A generation of scholars proposed that the centuries between roughly 250 and 750 constituted their own distinct period, which they called late antiquity. This was its own thing, with its own cultural achievements, its own intellectual movements, and its own logic. This approach emphasized continuity rather than the traditional rupture and collapse narrative. The spread of Christianity, the gradual transformation of Roman institutions, the emergence of new art forms and literary traditions, and the development of monasticism are all pointed to as innovations. All of these were treated as creative responses to changing circumstances rather than symptoms of decay. The world of the 5th and 6th centuries wasn't a broken version of Rome, and besides, Rome in the East hadn't fallen anyway. It had just transformed into something far more Hellenic. This reframing has been enormously productive for the field, but it certainly hasn't settled the debate. Some historians have argued that the late antiquity framework romanticizes a period that, for many ordinary people, involved genuine hardship. There was population decline, urban contraction, loss of literacy, and significantly increased violence. The archaeological record shows that in many parts of the former Western Roman Empire, material living standards dropped significantly between the 5th and 7th centuries. Calling this a transformation rather than a decline can feel like a bizarre academic euphemism more than anything else. The 476 date, the Arab conquest thesis, and the late antiquity framework aren't the only options on the table. Some historians have pointed to 410, when Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome for the first time in 800 years, as the true psychological turning point. Others have suggested 529 as a symbolic starting point, since that year saw the closing of the famous Philosophical Academy in Athens. Still others have argued for 568, when the Lombards invaded Italy and shattered what remained of the old Roman administrative framework on the peninsula. And some scholars, particularly those focused on British history, point to the withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain and the subsequent Anglo-Saxon migrations as the relevant starting point. It was the point where the empire began to lose core territory permanently, even if it was located in a periphery region of the empire. The date we choose for the beginning of the Middle Ages reflects a set of assumptions about what matters in history. If we pick 476, we're centering the story on political authority and the Roman state. If we follow the Arab conquest thesis, we're prioritizing economics and the Mediterranean world over Western Europe. If we embrace the ideas of late antiquity, we're arguing that cultural transformation matters more than political collapse. Each choice foregrounds certain developments and backgrounds others, and each one fundamentally shapes how the medieval world emerged from the ancient one. In the end, though, ultimately, antiquity and medieval are a vibe, and we know vibes when we feel them. On a rainy October day in 1849, a figure was found collapsed outside a Baltimore tavern, delirious, muddied, and dressed in shabby clothes that didn't appear to be his own. Passers-by were stunned to realize the man in the gutter was none other than Edgar Allan Poe, the famed author of eerie tales and poems. He was quickly taken to Washington College Hospital for treatment, but in the 4 days leading up to his death on October 7th, Poe never fully regained consciousness. Instead, he drifted in and out of delirium, reportedly plagued by vivid hallucinations. The night before he died, according to his attending physician, Dr. John Moran, Poe even cried out repeatedly for someone named Reynolds, a mysterious reference that's unexplained. Early that Sunday morning, Edgar Allan Poe died at age 40. The official cause recorded as phrenitis, or swelling of the brain, a vague diagnosis used at the time. In his death, he would create a mystery as perplexing and macabre as one of his own stories. Poe's final journey began with high hopes. He spent the summer of 1849 in Richmond, Virginia, pursuing a new literary venture while recovering from a serious illness. While there, he rekindled a romance with an old sweetheart and planned to remarry, looking toward a brighter future. On September 27th, 1849, Poe departed Richmond, intending to travel north via Baltimore to Philadelphia and then to New York. Yet somewhere along this route, Edgar Allan Poe vanished. He never arrived in Philadelphia, nor did he reach New York as planned. For nearly a week, the writer's whereabouts were completely unknown. It wasn't until October 3rd that he resurfaced in the worst possible state. That day, Poe was found slumped near a polling station in Baltimore, incoherent and in distress. This sudden reappearance, with Poe in dire condition and far off course from his intended journey, only deepened the mystery surrounding his final days. Poe spent his remaining hours confined at the hospital, largely alone and delirious. He was kept in a section reserved for patients found intoxicated, and no visitors were allowed to see him. The only witness to his last moments was Dr. John Moran. He described Poe as slipping in and out of consciousness, rambling in complete delirium. The doctor claimed that Poe's final words were a soft plea for God to help my poor soul, uttered in the early hours of October 7th. However, Moran's credibility has since come under scrutiny. Throughout the years, Moran told inconsistent versions of Poe's last days, leading many to doubt his testimony. With all medical records now lost to history, separating fact from fiction in Poe's final hours is impossible. Despite being well known in his own time, Poe's funeral was a brief and sparsely attended affair. Only a few family members and close friends braved the damp, chilly weather to see him laid to rest. In the aftermath, Poe's reputation suffered almost as much as his body did in his final days. A hostile obituary written by his rival Rufus Griswold maligned Poe as a drunken, depraved madman with numerous false or exaggerated claims. Published under a pseudonym, this libelous piece was widely read and, for a time, accepted as truth. It helped cement the image of Poe dying in disgrace due to alcoholism, a strong stigma at the time that would cling to his legacy for years. Meanwhile, the real cause of Poe's death remained uncertain, and it soon became the subject of intense speculation. For decades, many assumed that Poe simply drank himself to death, as was commonly stated in the media of the time. Poe's collapse and delirium were easily attributed to alcohol by his contemporaries, and his story was used as a case study in alcoholic degeneracy by the temperance movement. Over time, however, the alcohol theory has been widely challenged. Poe did struggle with drinking, but he wasn't the habitual drunk that many imagined. Friends noted that Poe had a severe sensitivity to alcohol. Even one glass of wine could leave him staggering, and that he often abstained for months at a time. In fact, Poe was a member of the Sons of Temperance, and by all accounts stayed sober during his final period in Richmond. Thus, while Poe had periods of excess in his life, modern experts doubt that alcohol alone can account for the peculiar circumstances of his death. That said, it does remain a serious possibility, as he could have relapsed into a severe binge episode. One of the most enduring and bizarre theories is that Poe was the victim of a violent election scam known as cooping. In 19th century Baltimore, gangs would kidnap unsuspecting individuals, force them to drink, and then disguise them to vote multiple times under different names. Such voter fraud was rampant in Baltimore at the time, and tellingly, Poe was found on Election Day outside a polling site notorious for cooping activity. The cooping theory neatly explains several oddities of Poe's case, such as why he was discovered in an incoherent state and why he was wearing clothes that didn't belong to him. However, others have noted that Poe was a well-known and distinctive-looking figure, and no one reported seeing him brought to any polling stations. Despite some skepticism, cooping remains one of the most plausible explanations for Poe's untimely fate. Cooping isn't the only foul play scenario that has been suggested, though the others are rather straightforward accounts of him being beat up and robbed by random thugs or goons. Apart from external foul play, a host of medical explanations have been proposed for Poe's baffling end. Over the years, scholars and doctors have retroactively diagnosed Poe with a litany of ailments, including heart disease, diabetes, epilepsy, meningitis, cholera, syphilis, and more. Among the more prominent theories is rabies. In 1996, a medical study of Poe's symptoms concluded that he exhibited classic signs of rabies infection. However, the major problem with this theory is that there's no evidence whatsoever to indicate that he was bit by a rabid animal. Contemporary physicians were familiar with the concept of rabies, and as an interesting aside, it's actually one of the first medical conditions ever documented. In ancient Sumeria, a portion of a text was discovered, which warned people that dog bites can spread a fatal disease, but only under certain rare and unusual conditions. Other diagnoses focus on more ordinary illnesses. One hypothesis suggests Poe succumbed to influenza that developed into deadly pneumonia. He had been ill before leaving Richmond and was caught in cold, rainy weather in Baltimore, factors which could have led to a severe fever and delirium. Perhaps the most eerie theory involves a brain tumor. When Poe's body was exhumed in 1875 to be moved to a new grave, witnesses noted a strange calcified mass inside his skull. More than 170 years later, the truth behind Edgar Allan Poe's death still remains elusive, with no single theory proving definitive. In the end, the man who redefined mystery and horror left behind a legacy that no amount of sleuthing is able to crack. In the autumn of 410 AD, somewhere near the city of Consentia in southern Italy, a river was forced from its bed. Thousands of captive laborers dug into the exposed riverbed, carving out a grave large enough for a king, his horse, his armor, and wagon loads of stolen Roman gold. When the work was done, the waters of the Busento were released to flow back over the burial site, hiding it beneath a current that would run for centuries. Then, according to the 6th century Gothic historian Jordanes, every single one of those workers was put to death. 1,600 years later, nobody has found so much as a coin. That's the legend of Alaric, king of the Visigoths, the man who broke Rome, and the legendary lost treasure that vanished with him into the mud of southern Italy. Here's what most people get wrong about Alaric, to the extent that they know about him at all. He wasn't some savage warlord who hated civilization. He was a product of Roman civilization, and in essence he wanted to be a Roman, perhaps more so than many Roman citizens of the time. Born around 370, Alaric grew up among Gothic veterans who'd already fought alongside Roman armies. He served as a commander of Gothic foederati, allied troops bound by treaty to fight for Rome in exchange for land and a measure of autonomy. In 394, he led roughly 10,000 of his own men into battle on behalf of Emperor Theodosius I against the usurper Eugenius. The Goths took devastating casualties in the service of the Roman Empire, and they expected a significant reward for what they had accomplished. In better times, this likely would have happened, but the Roman Empire in the late 4th century was the exact opposite of better times. His reward for that sacrifice was essentially nothing. No land, no titles, no recognition worth the comrades he'd sacrificed. Alaric made it his life's goal to right this wrong and achieve a form of compensation and justice for his people. When Theodosius died in 395 and the empire split between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, Alaric saw his opportunity. The Visigoths proclaimed him their king, and for the next 15 years he did something that doesn't fit the popular image of a barbarian conqueror. He negotiated. What Alaric wanted wasn't the destruction of Rome. He wanted a permanent homeland for his people, formal recognition of them as Roman citizens, and a secure military command. He wanted, in short, to belong to the Roman Empire, and he wanted to be a servant rather than a master in his own right. Rome's answer, delivered through a revolving door of scheming officials and the weak Emperor Honorius, hiding safely behind the marshes of Ravenna, was consistently no. By 397, the Eastern Emperor Arcadius had appointed Alaric Magister Militum in Illyricum, a senior Roman military rank. However, in what was viewed as a shocking betrayal by Alaric, the Western court refused to honor the arrangement or meet his demands for permanent settlement. By 408, Alaric had run out of patience, and he figured the only way he could press his demands were with his soldiers. He besieged Rome and squeezed out a colossal ransom, reportedly including thousands of pounds of gold and silver, as well as exotic goods from the Far East, including silks and pepper. He withdrew, tried diplomacy again, was rebuffed again, and in 409 he marched back and briefly installed a puppet emperor named Priscus Attalus, who proved useless. Finally, on the night of August 24th, 410, the gates of Rome were opened to his army. Who opened them remains a matter of debate, but the result was the same, though the general view has been that he had used infiltrators in the city to do so. For the first time in nearly 800 years, a foreign army walked into Rome, or at the very least, a somewhat foreign army. It's important to remember that Alaric did have some official recognition from the Eastern Emperor after all, and by the time this occurred, a large portion of Rome's citizens were already Germanic. Notably, these Germanic people who were located in the capital were vastly disproportionately military men, some of whom were Visigoths themselves. What followed was a sack that lasted 3 days, and by the standards of ancient warfare, it was remarkably restrained. Alaric's Visigoths were Christians, and they reportedly spared churches and all those who took refuge in them, even non-believers. There was looting, certainly. Centuries of accumulated wealth changed hands, but the wholesale destruction that would characterize the Vandal sack 45 years later didn't happen here. Still, the psychological blow was devastating. Rome hadn't fallen to an outside force since the Gauls under Brennus around 390 BC. The Eternal City, the center of the known world, the seat of an empire that once stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, had been humbled by a people it considered beneath contempt. Alaric didn't linger, and he marched his army south through Italy, reportedly hauling the plunder in wagon trains. He reportedly had plans to cross into Sicily, and from there into the grain-rich provinces of North Africa, but fate had other ideas. A storm scattered his fleet before the crossing could be made, and within weeks Alaric himself fell ill. He died at Consentia, modern Cosenza, probably of fever, at roughly 40 years of age. He was succeeded by his brother-in-law Athalf, who would eventually lead the Visigoths into Gaul and Hispania, but Alaric himself would never see any of it. What happened next is where history blurs into legend. Jordanes, writing in his 6th century work commonly known as the Getica, provides the only detailed account. According to him, the Visigoths diverted the Busento River near its confluence with the Crathes, and ordered captive laborers to dig a burial chamber in the exposed riverbed. There they set about interring Alaric with his treasures, likely as a holdover from pre-Christian Germanic pagan practices. The river was then returned to its course, so as to ensure that this massive hoard of wealth was never found. And to ensure that no one would ever find the grave, the workers who'd built it were all eliminated down to the man. It's a spectacular story, dramatic, cinematic, and almost perfectly designed to resist actual historical verification. This is where things get interesting for anyone who cares about evidence rather than legend. The treasure Alaric carried south from Rome was, by all accounts, enormous. But its exact contents are a matter of speculation. Some modern writers have claimed that the hoard included treasures from the Temple of Jerusalem. These included the golden menorah and other objects that Titus had looted from the Second Temple in the year 70, and which had been held in Rome for centuries. In fact, you can still see them carved into the Arch of Titus in Rome today. It's a thrilling idea that these ancient treasures may be buried in Italy under a river, but the evidence doesn't support it. The historian Procopius records that the temple treasures were taken not by Alaric, but by the Vandals under Gaiseric, when they sacked Rome in 455. Those treasures reportedly ended up in Carthage and were recovered by the Byzantine general Belisarius in 533 and brought to Constantinople. So what was buried with him? Probably a significant portion of the gold, silver, and valuables extracted from Rome, both from the ransom payments and from the sack itself. How much that's worth in modern terms is anyone's guess, but estimates have ranged into the tens of billions. People have been looking for Alaric's grave for centuries, and they've found precisely nothing. The first major excavation in the mid-1700s came up completely empty. In the early 1800s, an earthquake drained part of the Busento, prompting a fresh wave of treasure hunters, including the French writer Alexandre Dumas, who took an interest in the search. In October 2015, Italian archaeologists, backed by the Cosenza municipal government, launched what was billed as the most sophisticated attempt yet. They deployed drones, ground-penetrating radar, infrared sensors, and electromagnetic instruments, but they too found nothing. Ultimately, though, 16 centuries of flooding, erosion, and shifting river courses have completely transformed the terrain. If there is a burial chamber down there, it could be dozens of feet below the current riverbed, or off to one side where the water used to run, or it could have simply been crushed and scattered by geological forces that don't care about Gothic kings or Roman treasures. There's another possibility worth taking seriously, and it's the one that historians find hardest to ignore. Maybe the burial never happened the way Jordanes described it. Jordanes was writing roughly 150 years after Alaric's death, and he based much of his account on the earlier work of Cassiodorus, whose work is now lost. We're essentially trusting a copy of a copy, written in a tradition that valued dramatic storytelling and moral narratives as much as factual accuracy. Of course, the river burial may be a genuine historical event, faithfully transmitted through oral and written tradition. Or it may be an embellished version of a more ordinary burial, inflated over generations to match the grandeur of a king who'd conquered Rome. The elimination of the laborers is a particularly theatrical detail, the kind of thing that sounds engineered to explain why nobody can find the grave. In fact, it's a common motif across cultures regarding great conquerors whose burial sites are unknown, with the Genghis Khan story perhaps being the most famous. Alaric's treasure occupies a very peculiar space in history, too well attested to entirely dismiss, and too unverifiable to confirm without further physical evidence. There's a small hilltop in northern Japan where two dirt mounds sit inside wooden fences, surrounded by wildflowers and a bamboo grove. One mound reportedly holds the ear of a man named Isukiri. The other, according to a placard maintained by the local tourism board, holds the remains of Jesus Christ. In this version of history, he escaped to rural Aomori Prefecture, married a garlic farmer's daughter, raised 3 kids, and lived to the age of 106. And the strangest part isn't the claim itself, it's the fact that every June, dozens of locals gather at this grave in kimonos and perform a traditional Shinto ceremony. They dance in circles around what they believe is the final resting place of the Son of God, and virtually none of them are Christian. Shingo sits in the mountains of Aomori Prefecture, about as far north as you can go on Honshu before you run out of island. For most of its history, it was known as Hirai, a quiet farming village producing garlic and dairy, and it wasn't the kind of place that attracted outsiders. That changed in 1935, when a Shinto priest named Takeuchi Kiyomaro arrived in the village with a painter named Banzan Toya. He claimed to have decoded a set of ancient family documents that pointed to this specific patch of earth as the burial site of Jesus. The documents, written in an obscure script that Takeuchi said had been passed down through his family for generations, laid out a completely alternate history of Christ's life. In this version, Jesus visited Japan as a young man, learned the language and studied philosophy for over a decade, and only then returned to Judea to begin his ministry. When things went sideways in Jerusalem, the story goes, it wasn't Jesus who ended up on the cross. Instead, it was his younger brother, Isukiri, who supposedly took his place while Jesus fled east across Siberia, eventually reaching the coast of northern Japan. And yes, in this version of events, he somehow acquires a fully Japanese biological brother, though the details on how this occurred are quite sparse. Jesus, in this bizarre account of events, had retrieved his Japanese brother's body, explaining the empty tomb. On the 26th of May, 1935, Takeuchi and Toya reportedly located 2 mounds on a hill above the village and declared them the graves of Jesus and his brother. The very next day, Toya also claimed to have stumbled upon one of Japan's supposed ancient Egyptian pyramids nearby. This is a find that should probably tell you something about the general reliability of the expedition and the level of scholarship going on here. According to the Takeuchi documents, once Jesus reached Hirai, he assumed a new identity. He went by the name Daitenku Taro Jurai, settled into village life, and married a farmer's daughter named Miyuko, who was reportedly about 20 years old at the time. They had 3 daughters together, and Jesus took up garlic farming, apparently becoming quite successful in this venture. By this account, he lived a quiet, anonymous life for decades, finally passing away at the improbable age of 106. The eldest daughter allegedly married into the Sawaguchi family, a local clan who'd farmed the land around the burial mounds for generations. The Sawaguchis became central to the legend, and their family crest allegedly looks a lot like the Star of David. And I say allegedly here because, as you can see, it's simply just a 5-pointed star and has little apparent in common with the 6-pointed Star of David. And here's where I should mention something interesting that most people aren't well aware of. The Star of David symbol only became associated with Judaism in the Middle Ages and didn't become the dominant symbol until the Enlightenment era. Before that, the dominant symbol associated with Judaism, by far, was the menorah. Now, if the Sawaguchi family had a menorah-like symbol for a family crest that went back prior to this claim, that would most definitely be an interesting fact, but they clearly don't. The family reportedly maintained a tradition of marking newborns' foreheads with a cross drawn in ink or charcoal the first time the child was taken outdoors. Interestingly, though, if this was a real tradition, this could be associated with Japan's crypto-Christian communities. Alternatively, it could have something to do with the Tokugawa policy of portraying Jesus Christ in a very unconventional manner. During the Edo period, Christianity was harshly suppressed by the authorities, and they portrayed Jesus as essentially what amounts to being a powerful wizard. Christian symbols were occasionally used by people who weren't Christian, but still believed the wizardry propaganda. In essence, they could have theoretically seen the cross as a magical symbol to protect vulnerable newborns, though that's speculative on my part. According to Takeuchi and Toya, they also located a member of the family who had blue or green eyes, which they claimed was proof of a link to the Middle East. Proponents of the theory have also pointed to the village's old name, Herai, claiming it offered more potential proof. Under this interpretation, which linguists have not endorsed, the name itself was derived from the word Hebrew. The entire claim rests on the documents provided by Takeuchi Kiyomaro, and the documents themselves rest on essentially nothing. Takeuchi Kiyomaro wasn't just a usual Shinto priest, practicing within the loose orthodoxy of that faith. He was the founder of a Shinto-style new religion, and he'd been circulating claims about the secret history of Japan for years before the expedition. His documents supposedly recorded events from before the reign of the legendary Emperor Jinmu, placing Japan at the center of all world civilizations and religions. As I mentioned, he was also claiming to find Egyptian pyramids in Japan, and he wasn't claiming that Egyptians came to Japan. Instead, he was claiming that an intrepid group of Japanese adventurers journeyed to ancient Egypt to teach them, quote-unquote, pyramid construction with Yamato characteristics. The Jesus narrative was just one piece of a much wider revisionist history where he attempted to connect all the world's major religions to Japan. The idea that Jesus himself had come to Japan to study before beginning his ministry, and that Japan had served as his final refuge, fit neatly into the idea of the significance of Japan. Notably, the original documents were allegedly seized by the Japanese authorities in the 1930s and taken to Tokyo to be placed in a museum. Whether this is true or not is a historical mystery in and of itself, though it doesn't seem implausible. The Japanese government of that era had elements in it that legitimately advocated that Genghis Khan was actually the Japanese general Minamoto no Yoshitsune. That is to say, they may have been highly interested in finding proof that Jesus Christ trained in Japan before beginning his ministry, It didn't say that he was Japanese, but it implicitly took Christianity and attempted to make it a Japanese-influenced tradition. This may have also served a propaganda element in an attempt to have Japan's small but highly wealthy and influential Christian community support Japan's imperial ambition. If it is true that the documents were brought to a museum, they were supposedly destroyed when the museum where they were stored was bombed sometime in 1944 or 1945. Regardless of the reality of this destruction, the academic consensus, both in Japan and internationally, is that the documents were amateurish forgeries. Despite all of this, the legend stuck, and in 1964, the local Chamber of Commerce launched the Kirisuto Matsuri, or the Christ Festival. A Shinto priest approaches the mound and recites ritual prayers, while guests offer ceremonial branches and perform Shinto and Buddhist dances. The village itself has leaned into the oddity of it all, and a small museum near the gravesite displays what it claims are elements that prove the connection of Jesus to Japan. Funny enough, the tomb's upkeep has been funded in part by the profits from a local yogurt company, a detail so absurd it almost feels like it was invented to make the story more charming. The legend of Jesus in Shingo isn't evidence of anything about the historical Jesus whatsoever, and no credible historian or archaeologist supports the claim. The documents behind it were produced by an eccentric attempted founder of a religion during one of the most ideologically charged periods in Japanese history. It, in essence, tells of a time when the Japanese were so willing to believe in their own greatness that it seemed obvious that Jesus Christ himself had to have a Japanese connection. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to hit the share button and send this video to anyone you know who enjoys historical content or mysteries in general. There's an object in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna that's been lying about its age for roughly 1,000 years. It's called the Saber of Charlemagne, and by all modern analysis, Charlemagne never touched it. The blade dates to roughly 900 to 950, and Charlemagne died in 814. That's at minimum an 86-year gap between the man and the weapon that carries his name. Yet for centuries, this saber was treated as one of the most sacred objects in European political ceremony, carried during coronations, venerated as a relic of imperial authority. The saber itself is a genuinely impressive physical object. It measures about 3 feet in total length with a curved, single-edged blade, roughly 30 inches long. The hilt fittings are gilded copper, decorated with gold, silver, and precious stones, set into wood and fish skin. It's a weapon designed for mounted combat, optimized for slashing from horseback at speed. The curved blade geometry and overall profile of the sword look clearly to the steppe traditions of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, not to the Franks. Scholars have linked it most convincingly to the Magyar cultural sphere, placing its manufacture in the first half of the 10th century. This places it during or shortly after the Hungarian settlement of the Carpathian Basin, around 895, and metallurgical examination supports this. The blade's construction and its pommel form all parallel Hungarian-type sabers recovered from burial sites of the same period. This very clearly isn't a Frankish weapon, and Charlemagne's warriors generally carried straight, double-edged swords, a descendant of Roman blades. No 9th century Frankish chronicle mentions the emperor owning anything resembling a curved saber, a weapon entirely foreign to Western Europe at that point. So how did a Magyar cavalry saber end up attributed to one of the most important people in world history? The traditional story traces back to the year 1000, when Emperor Otto III reportedly opened Charlemagne's tomb in Aachen. According to medieval chroniclers, Otto found Charlemagne seated upright on a golden throne in a vaulted crypt beneath the Church of St. Mary. He was reportedly wearing a crown of gold and jewels and holding a scepter, symbolizing his divinely ordained dominion over the world. The saber, the story goes, was recovered from this same occasion. It's an evocative image, and it served Otto's purposes perfectly. He was a young emperor desperate to legitimate his rule by connecting himself physically to the Carolingian legacy. Whether he actually found the saber in the tomb, or simply added it to the imperial collection around the same time, is something we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the dating of the blade is compatible with Otto III's era, but rules out any direct connection to Charlemagne himself. Regardless of its true origins, the saber became a fixture of imperial ceremony. It formed part of what was known as the Aachen Jewels, a collection of regalia kept at the cathedral and used during the coronation of Holy Roman emperors. During the ceremony, the new emperor would be girded with the saber as a symbol of martial authority and continuity with Charlemagne's legacy. The act of buckling on this weapon was supposed to transfer something intangible, a direct line of power stretching back to the founding emperor of Western Christendom. It didn't matter that the saber was actually Hungarian, and it didn't matter that the real Charlemagne wouldn't have recognized it as a weapon from his own culture. What mattered was the story, and that story apparently worked for 800 years, with no real questioning about how such a weapon could be attributed to Charlemagne. The saber's physical journey is almost as dramatic as its mythology. When French revolutionary troops approached Aachen in 1794, the regalia were hurriedly evacuated in an attempt to prevent their destruction or looting. They were first sent to a Capuchin abbey in Paderborn, then to Hildesheim in 1798, and finally to Vienna in 1801, where they've remained ever since. The saber now sits in the imperial treasury at the Hofburg alongside the rest of the Aachen and Nuremberg regalia. It's one of the best preserved early medieval sabers in existence, largely because it spent its life in a treasury rather than in the ground. Most comparable weapons from the same period survive only as corroded fragments pulled from archaeological sites. This one still has its hilt fittings intact, its blade in near original condition, and the irony is that its misattribution is what saved it. Had anyone realized it was a 10th century Hungarian weapon rather than the personal blade of Charlemagne, it might never have been preserved with such care. And without that connection, we'd likely never have such a finely preserved Hungarian sword from this period. Take a moment to picture a place where 33,000 people live inside a single city block. It's a single building, roughly the size of 2 football fields, stacked 14 stories high, with no architects, no building codes, no police, and no government. It's a place where the hallways are so narrow you can touch both walls with your elbows, where sunlight hasn't reached the ground floor since the 1960s. Residents even carry umbrellas indoors to shield themselves from the water dripping through cracked pipes overhead. And here's the thing. That place was absolutely real. It stood in Hong Kong until 1994, and for most of its life neither Britain nor China would claim responsibility for it. This is the strange true story of the Kowloon Walled City, a location that seems like it was ripped out of a cyberpunk novel. The origins of Kowloon Walled City go back to the Song dynasty, roughly 1,000 years ago, when Chinese authorities established a small military outpost on the Kowloon Peninsula. By the mid-19th century, as British colonial power expanded across Hong Kong, the Qing government decided to fortify that long-neglected outpost. In 1847, a proper stone-walled garrison was constructed, complete with a resident mandarin and barracks for a small detachment of Qing soldiers. Its purpose was plain enough: maintain a Chinese foothold on the peninsula and keep an eye on the British, who had taken Hong Kong Island just 5 years earlier. Then came the treaty that would accidentally create one of the strangest places on Earth. In 1898, the Second Convention of Peking granted Britain a 99-year lease on a large swathe of land surrounding Hong Kong, known as the New Territories, but there was a clause. The small walled city of Kowloon, that old Qing garrison, would remain under Chinese jurisdiction. On paper, this seemed manageable, but in practice, it created a legal absurdity that would fester for nearly a century. When British forces arrived at the walled city in April 1899, they found the Viceroy's soldiers already gone. Only the Mandarin and about 150 residents remained, and Britain effectively took control of the area, but China never formally surrendered its claim. For decades, neither government did much of anything with it. The walled city sat there, a jurisdictional orphan, belonging to the Qing on paper, and no one in practice. During the 1930s and 1940s, waves of refugees flooded into Hong Kong from mainland China due to a series of ongoing conflicts, both domestic and worldwide in scope. Many of them ended up in the cheapest, least regulated place they could find, the old walled city. Without any governing authority enforcing building standards, people built upward, floor by floor, apartment by apartment, until the structures merged into a single enormous mass of concrete. Builders simply added another story on top of whatever already existed. By the 1950s, the walled city had become something without any real precedent, a densely packed urban enclave with no functioning government. Nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum, and the vacuum here was filled by triad gangs. Groups like the 14K, the Sun Yi On, and the Woshing Wo moved in and turned the city into a haven for gambling parlors, opium dens, and even more sinister activities. Police would only enter in large groups, and even then, the narrow alleyways and labyrinthine corridors made enforcement close to impossible. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, crime inside the walled city hit its peak, and the Hong Kong authorities largely gave up trying to control what happened behind those walls. It took a sustained campaign in the early 1970s to break the triad's grip, and Hong Kong police conducted more than 3,500 raids on the walled city. Triads didn't vanish overnight, but their stranglehold loosened considerably, and the character of the walled city began to shift in ways nobody had predicted. What emerged after the triads retreated wasn't chaos. It was something closer to improvised society. The residents of the walled city, left to fend for themselves by two governments, built a functioning community from the ground up. They laid their own water pipes, organized informal garbage collection, and established a postal system. With the triads largely expunged, factories, shops, restaurants, and medical clinics filled the lower floors. The upper floors were residential, with families crammed into apartments often smaller than 250 square feet. The most famous feature of the city's informal economy was its dental clinics. Over 150 unlicensed dentists operated along what locals called Dentist Street, offering affordable care to people who couldn't access formal dental care. The dentists weren't licensed by Hong Kong standards, but they served a real need, and patients even came from outside the walled city specifically to visit them. Navigating the interior was disorienting even for people who'd lived there for years. The alleyways between buildings were often only about 6 or 7 feet wide. At ground level, fluorescent lights replaced the sun, which hadn't penetrated that deep in years. Water dripped constantly from overhead pipes, and the air was thick with the competing smells of cooking food, machine oil from small factories, and damp concrete. While the walled city is often presented as something of a hellscape, many of the people who lived there didn't hate it. A group of Hong Kong-based scholars who analyzed oral histories from former residents concluded that the community had strong social bonds and affordable housing. Because everyone is in the same destitute situation, people looked out for each other, and they shared resources in a way others in Hong Kong didn't. They built something that worked, even if it looked from the outside like it shouldn't. By the late 1980s, however, the walled city's days were numbered. A government survey in 1987 counted approximately 33,000 residents packed into just 2.6 hectares, a population density of roughly 1.2 million people per square kilometer. To put that into some sort of perspective, it was estimated to be by far the most densely populated place on Earth. In January 1987, the Hong Kong government formally announced plans for demolition, and the eviction process was long and contentious. Residents were offered compensation, but many resisted, and it took years of negotiation before the last holdouts left. Demolition began in March 1993 and was completed by April 1994, and in December 1995, Kowloon Walled City Park opened on the site. A manicured Chinese garden with ornamental ponds and pavilions now stands where 33,000 people once lived, stacked on top of each other in near total darkness. The walled city is often treated as a curiosity, a freak accident of history, and it definitely was. But it was also a place where ordinary people, caught between empires and abandoned by bureaucracies, figured out how to live. They built a city without permission, governed themselves without a formal government, and created a real community. It's tempting to romanticize that, of course, and ultimately it really shouldn't be romanticized at all. The conditions were genuinely awful by almost any standard of public health and safety, and it was a legitimately dangerous place. But there's something in the story of the walled city that's hard to shake. A reminder that humanity will flourish even in the most harsh and frankly bizarre conditions. Every spring, billions of people around the world celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ with an unusual tradition of a giant rabbit breaking into their house overnight and hiding eggs. And nobody, not historians, not folklorists, not theologians, can fully explain how that happened. The trail of evidence is broken, contradictory, and littered with academic feuds that have been going on for over a century. There are at least 3 competing origin stories, none of them conclusive, and the truth is probably some messy collision of all of them. So let's trace how a hare ended up at the center of Christianity's most important holiday, and why the answer is far stranger than the question. The oldest and most popular explanation for the Easter Bunny begins with a goddess named Astraea. In 725, the Venerable Bede, an English monk and one of the most respected scholars of the early medieval period, wrote a treatise called De Temporum Ratione. It was essentially a guide to calculating the date of Easter, which of course shifts in dates every year. In it, he mentioned almost offhandedly that the Anglo-Saxon month of April was called Ostermoneth, named after a goddess called Astraea. He mentioned that there were traditionally feasts held in her honor during this month, but that was it. There was no description of rituals or anything more. For over 1,000 years, that single reference sat mostly unexamined. Then in 1835, the philologist Jacob Grimm published his Deutsche Mythologie and attempted to reconstruct a continental Germanic equivalent of this goddess of spring. Working from linguistic patterns and comparative mythology, he hypothesized that the old High German name for Easter pointed to a goddess he called Ostara, a figure associated with spring. Grimm's reconstruction was speculative, and he admitted as much, and he had no primary sources confirming Ostara's existence. He was building a theory from the architecture of language, not from temples or inscriptions. Grimm's Ostara caught fire in the popular imagination, and over the following decades, writers and folklorists began attributing all sorts of spring fertility symbols to her, including hares. The problem is that there's no evidence connecting Ostara to hares in any source. Bede didn't mention animals at all, and Grimm didn't mention hares. The association appears to have been layered on later, largely by writers who assumed that a spring goddess must logically have been associated with fertility symbols. It's a reasonable assumption, but reasonable assumptions aren't evidence, and the academic community remains deeply divided on the question. If the pagan goddess theory has problems, the Christian theory is at least equally strange, though much better attested. Throughout the medieval period, hares appeared frequently in Christian art and architecture, but not as pagan holdovers. They showed up as symbols of Mary, and the reasoning was rooted in a widespread belief, inherited from classical natural history, that hares could conceive without mating. This wasn't true, of course, but the misconception persisted for centuries across Europe, and medieval theologians seized on it. A creature that could supposedly reproduce without any form of contact became a natural symbol for the birth of Christ. Because of this, illuminated manuscripts and paintings from Northern Europe fairly regularly depicted hares alongside Mary. The first time anyone wrote down the specific idea of a hare delivering Easter eggs was in 1682. A German physician published a medical treatise with the Latin title De Ovis Pascalibus, or in English, On Easter Eggs. In it, he described a folk belief common in Alsace and the Palatinate region, that an Easter hare laid colored eggs and hid them in gardens for children to find. The doctor wasn't endorsing the tradition, he was actually warning that eating too many eggs after the Lenten fast could cause digestive problems. But in doing so, he left behind the earliest known written record of the Easter Bunny, as we'd recognize it today. The tradition appears to have been predominantly Lutheran and was concentrated in German-speaking Protestant communities. The Easter hare, the Osterhase, functioned as a judge figure, deciding whether children had been good enough during Lent to deserve eggs. It was essentially a spring version of the naughty or nice system that would later become associated with Santa Claus. Children would build nests out of caps and bonnets the night before Easter, and if they'd behaved, they'd find the nests filled with colored eggs come morning. If this sounds so familiar, it's because this is the version of the Easter Bunny that ended up crossing the Atlantic. German-speaking immigrants, particularly those who settled in Pennsylvania in the 1700s, brought this peculiar Easter creature with them. From Pennsylvania, the tradition slowly spread outward across the colonies, and over the course of the 19th century, evolved from a regional curiosity into a broadly national custom. By the mid-19th century, American confectioners had begun producing sugar and pastry eggs for Easter, and German chocolate makers weren't far behind. By the 1890s, the first chocolate Easter bunnies had appeared, and the confectionery industry on both sides of the Atlantic was beginning to recognize Easter as a commercial opportunity. The Easter hare was no longer a quiet folk belief passed down through families at the dinner table. It was a marketing opportunity, and a lucrative one at that. The 20th century completed the transformation, and mass production would eventually make chocolate bunnies cheap and ubiquitous. Greeting card companies, candy manufacturers, and retailers collectively turned the Easter Bunny into something approaching a secular mascot for the holiday. By mid-century, the Easter Bunny had a cultural presence that had almost nothing to do with Germanic folk traditions, pagan goddesses, or medieval understanding of bunny biology. It had become its own thing entirely, a free-floating commercial symbol that most people accepted, without ever wondering where it came from or what it once meant. So where does all of that leave us? The honest answer to the question of where the Easter Bunny came from is that nobody knows for certain. The Ostre theory is appealing but rests on a single 8th century reference and a speculative 19th century linguistic reconstruction. The Christian symbolism theory explains the hare's presence in religious art, but doesn't account for the egg-delivering Easter hare specifically. The German folk tradition is the best documented direct ancestor of the modern Easter Bunny, but it doesn't explain where the Germans got the idea in the first place. It's entirely possible that the German practice was derived from the Christian symbolism theory, but it's equally possible it was a cultural echo of a pre-Christian practice. Each thread leads somewhere, but none of them leads all the way back to a definitive beginning. What we can say is that hares have meant something to Europeans for thousands of years, associated at various times with various religious and spiritual ideas. When German Lutherans in the 17th century formalized a tradition of an egg-bearing Easter hare, they were drawing on a well of symbolism far deeper than they probably realized. And when that tradition landed in America and got swallowed by the machinery of commercial culture, it lost most of its original context, but gained something else: universality. The Easter Bunny doesn't mean what it used to mean, but, or perhaps because, it means something to nearly everyone. Somewhere in the forests of medieval Prussia, there was supposedly a temple so important that every Baltic pagan from the coast of Lithuania to the borders of Poland answered to its high priest. This figure, known as the Cryo, was described as a kind of pagan pope who commanded absolute spiritual authority over the Old Prussians, the Lithuanians, and the Balts of Livonia. His seat of power was a sacred complex known as Romuva, and it allegedly contained an eternally burning flame, an evergreen oak of enormous size, and idols representing a trinity of gods. It's the kind of story that sounds almost too perfect, and that should be your first clue that something is off. The problem with Romuva isn't that nobody wrote about it. The problem is that almost everything we think we know comes from exactly one man, writing with a very specific agenda, more than a century after the events he was describing. The sole contemporary source for the existence of Romuva is Peter von Duisburg, a priest of the Teutonic Order who composed his chronicle of the order's campaigns in Prussia. This chronicle covered the years between 1324 and 1326, and was written with a very specific purpose in mind. He was commissioned to write it by the Grand Master of the Order, and the result became the first major chronicle of the Teutonic Order's activities in the Baltic region. In it, Duisburg describes a place called Romuva, located in the Prussian territory of Nadruvia. He doesn't spend much time on architectural details or precise geography. What he focuses on is the Cryo, the chief priest who supposedly resided there and wielded religious authority over all the Baltic peoples. Duisburg portrays this figure as a direct counterpart to the Pope in Rome, someone whose word was spiritual law across a wide swathe of pagan territory. This framing is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and by the time Duisburg was writing, the Teutonic Order had been waging a brutal campaign against the pagan Prussians for roughly a century. The Order needed its crusade to look justified, and one effective way to do that was to portray Baltic paganism not as a scattered collection of local cults, but as an organized counter-church. Even the name Romuva was intended to be an affront to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, with the name itself being based upon the eternal city itself. Nearly 200 years after Duisburg put quill to parchment, a Dominican priest named Simon Grunau wrote his own history of Prussia. Grunau took Duisburg's sparse reference and turned it into something far more elaborate. According to Grunau, the temple at Romuva centered on a massive oak tree that stayed green throughout the year. An eternal flame burned at its base, tended by priests, and, in his telling, a group of Vestal priestesses, much like ancient Rome. The sacred enclosure also contained 3 idols: Patrimpas, a god of spring and flowing water; Perkunas, the thunder god; and Patulas, a god of the underworld. Grunau even gave the place a second name, Rikoyoto, and provided details about underground chambers and elaborate religious ceremonies. There's a problem with all of this, though. Scholars have identified that Grunau's most vivid editions bear a suspicious resemblance to descriptions of the temple at Uppsala in Sweden. This was a very well-known and widely read account recorded by the 11th century chronicler Adam of Bremen. The eternal flame, the sacred tree, the trinity of gods, even the Vestals. These are elements from Adam's account of Norse paganism, not from any known Prussian source. It appears that Grunau, writing centuries after the fact and lacking independent evidence, borrowed liberally from a description of a completely different pagan tradition. This means the most iconic images associated with Romuva, the ones that make it feel vivid and real, are almost certainly imported fiction of real Norse practices. You'd think that if a major religious complex existed in Nadruvia, there'd be some physical trace of it. But despite the Teutonic Knights eventually controlling the entire region, and despite modern archaeological efforts, no remains of Romuva have ever been found. The archaeological record is completely blank, and this is more damning than it might sound at first. The Teutonic Order documented their conquests with considerable diligence, and they recorded the destruction of pagan sites when they encountered them. In fact, foreign knights would come from all over Western Europe simply to destroy these sites, and they were very concerned with letting everyone know about their deeds. Yet there's no account of any Teutonic commander locating and dismantling Romuva. For a place that supposedly served as the spiritual capital of Baltic paganism, this silence is difficult to explain away. Some have speculated that when one temple was destroyed, another was simply erected elsewhere, making it a moving target rather than a fixed location. That's possible, but it's also completely unfalsifiable, and that's precisely the kind of explanation that should make anyone cautious. Scholars generally believe that Duisberg likely invented the temple, or at least radically distorted whatever local traditions he'd heard about. His goal was propaganda, the need to present Baltic paganism as a structured counter-church, rather than a series of eclectic folk beliefs without any real structure. This would have served the Teutonic Order's institutional needs perfectly. A centralized pagan religion with its own pope-like figure made the crusade against it look like a true holy war. The Teutonic Order needed continual funding from Rome and various polities in Western Europe, and they were competing with resources that could be directed to the Holy Land itself. Simply put, the Teutonic Knights needed to market their crusade by essentially adding a heathen pope who commanded all the forces of the Baltic pagans. Other scholars have been slightly more cautious, suggesting that some form of sacred site or religious gathering place may have existed, but that Duisberg overstated it. Baltic peoples certainly did have sacred groves and ritual sites. That much is well attested from multiple independent sources. The question is whether any single site held the pan-Baltic authority that Duisberg claims, or whether he was projecting a Christian institutional model for propaganda purposes. In the end, the temple at Romuva might have been real, we can't say for certain. But the version of it that lives in popular imagination, with its evergreen oak and eternal flame and trinity of idols, is almost certainly an invention. It's part Teutonic Order propaganda, part Nordic mythology transplanted onto Prussian soil, and a good helping of misunderstanding organized faiths versus decentralized faiths. What actually stood in the forests of old Prussia, if anything did at all, remains one of those questions the surviving sources simply aren't equipped to answer. Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles in 1770, an Austrian archduchess, married off to the future Louis XVI in a diplomatic alliance meant to cement peace between France and Austria. From the moment she set foot in the palace, her life was governed by an almost absurdly rigid system of court etiquette. Everything from the way she dressed in the morning to who handed her a glass of water was regulated by centuries of protocol. Dozens of courtiers watched her wake, eat, and go about daily routines that most people would consider intensely private. Despite this all, persistent rumors suggest that she was happiest while she was role-playing as a peasant, and there's good evidence that this did occur. When Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, one of his first gestures to his young queen was giving her the Petit Trianon, a small neoclassical chateau on the grounds of Versailles. The building had been commissioned by his grandfather Louis XV for his mistress Madame de Pompadour, though she died in 1764 before it was finished. For Marie Antoinette, it became a sanctuary, and she redecorated it to her own taste, and more importantly, established new rules for who could visit. At the Petit Trianon, the suffocating etiquette of the main palace didn't apply. She could invite whomever she liked, walk in the gardens without an entourage, and exist in something approaching genuine privacy. But it was what she built adjacent to the chateau that would come to define her legacy and fuel accusations that have followed her for over 2 centuries. Between 1783 and 1786, Marie Antoinette commissioned the construction of the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet in English. It was a miniature village tucked into the gardens, complete with a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, a dovecote, thatched roof cottages, and a small working farm stocked with animals. On the surface, it looked like a storybook version of rural French life, and that's precisely what her critics seized on. Here was the Queen of France, they said, building a fake village so she could dress up as a shepherd and pretend to understand the lives of the peasants her policies were starving. The reality was considerably more mundane than the legend. Marie Antoinette did spend significant time at the hamlet, and she did adopt simpler clothing while there. But unlike propaganda of the time, it wasn't actual peasant clothing. Her clothes were an aristocratic interpretation of simplicity, made from expensive imported fabric and accessorized with silk ribbons that cost more than peasants earned in their lives. To some, this made this attempt at role-playing rural life even more offensive. The hamlet itself was a functioning agricultural estate, and real farmers and their families lived and worked there, tending livestock and maintaining the gardens. Marie Antoinette reportedly enjoyed visiting the dairy and the farm, and some accounts suggest she participated in light activities like collecting eggs or supervising cows being milked. Interestingly, the milk was collected in porcelain vessels, elaborate pieces decorated with the Queen's coat of arms. Those porcelain milk pails tell you everything about the gap between the Queen's pastoral fantasy and actual peasant life. To outsiders, it appeared that she was enjoying a curated version of rural charm, with none of the hardship attached, all while the country suffered. The thing that often gets lost in retellings of this story is that Marie Antoinette wasn't doing anything unusual for her social class. The concept of the ornamental hamlet was a well-established trend among the European aristocracy throughout the 18th century. The Prince de Condé had built one at Chantilly as early as 1774, featuring rustic cottages with lavish interiors. This is widely thought to have directly inspired Marie Antoinette's own later project at Versailles. Across the Channel, English aristocrats were commissioning similar rustic retreats as part of the broader ornamental farm movement. The intellectual roots of the trend ran deep, drawing heavily on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, who wrote on the virtue of natural living and the corruption of civilization, had become enormously fashionable among the very elites whose lifestyles he was criticizing. Marie Antoinette embraced these ideas in other areas of her life too, championing maternal involvement and a more natural approach to raising her children. The hamlet was, in many ways, a physical expression of these ideas, filtered through the lens of someone who'd never experienced actual deprivation. The difference between her Hamlet and everyone else's was straightforward. She was the Queen of France during a financial crisis that was grinding the lower classes into poverty. This context turned a rather mundane, if perhaps completely tone-deaf aristocratic hobby into a political scandal. The accusations that Marie Antoinette was playing peasant didn't emerge from honest observation. They were part of a sustained, vicious propaganda campaign that had been targeting her since the late 1770s. Hundreds of anonymous pamphlets circulated through Paris, attacking her character, her spending, and her loyalty to France. They accused her of debasing the French state and of serving as an Austrian agent working against French interests. The Hamlet fit neatly into this narrative, since here was a foreign queen spending lavishly on a toy village while bread prices soared and the state careened toward bankruptcy. The famous phrase attributed to her, that she told starving subjects to eat cake since they didn't have any bread, was never said by Marie Antoinette. The anecdote appeared in Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765 and attributed to an unnamed French princess. Marie Antoinette, for her part, was living hundreds of miles away in Vienna and couldn't have been called a French princess regardless. In the end, historians now generally believe that Marie Antoinette did, to a certain extent, attempt to role-play as a peasant woman. But they also point out the fact that she took other inspiration from peasants, such as being moderately involved in raising her own children. According to some, this indicates that she had a genuine belief in the virtues of rustic life, and that she wasn't simply role-playing out of some sense of cruelty. She likely believed, following the reasoning of Rousseau, that the aristocratic way of life had become a corrupting force. In this sense, what she did was retreat into a carefully designed version of rural life that allowed her to escape the oppressive formality of Versailles. The Hamlet was a private space where she could hold informal gatherings and raise her children in a more relaxed and natural environment. It allowed her to indulge in the same idealization of a more natural life that many other wealthy Europeans were embracing at the time. That said, the cost of building and maintaining the Hamlet was enormous, funded by a state treasury that was hemorrhaging money. She had the porcelain milk pails, the manicured gardens designed to look wild, and the cottages that were rustic on the outside, but furnished with every luxury within. It was, in a sense, a partial inversion of the idea of a Potemkin village, where upon closer examination everything was unbelievably luxurious, rather than non-functional. All of it represented a vast disconnect between the Queen's experience and the reality of French rural life. Marie Antoinette likely wasn't intentionally mocking the poor and the downtrodden, as was later claimed. She was, in her own limited way, trying to live a simpler life within the only framework she'd ever known. The tragedy isn't that she was cruel, it's that she lacked the imagination, or perhaps the information, to understand how it looked from the outside for real people who were actually suffering. The Hamlet still stands in the gardens of Versailles today, restored and open to visitors, a quiet monument to perhaps the most lavish quote-unquote simple buildings in human history.